Trump's team are finalising plans to impose tariffs on every country that charges duties on US imports. But how wide could the trade war get? We're expecting the US administration to announce reciprocal tariffs later in a tit-for-tat aimed at every country that charges any duties on US goods. The details are still vague, but corporate America is nervous about who's next after duties on steel and aluminium were announced yesterday. Hetal Mehta is head of economic research at St James's Place. Hetal, with this idea of reciprocity, we now expect the EU, among others, to fire back at the US with tariffs of their own, don't we?
Yes, I think that's quite likely. We saw something similar when we had the kind of 2018-2019 trade wars. And I think it's a standard response. It is lose-lose for the economies involved, but unfortunately, it does look like that's likely, and that is going to be a drag on growth. I think for Europe, but also in the kind of medium term for the US as well.
What sort of macroeconomic impact would that have then?
So if we took, for example, a 10% tariff on European imports, so about 3% of the European economy relies on exports to the US. And so if you assume that kind of 10% tariff means a 10% reduction in export volumes, and then just allowing for the uncertainty as well, we think it could take up to 0.5% of European GDP. And when European GDP is barely growing at the moment, and maybe we might only get, say, 1% growth this year, there's a real chance that it could tip Europe into recession this year.
We've got CPI out in the US later today, of course. The market's inflation expectations have been rising slightly. Should we also expect then that these tariffs would push up prices in America?
I think we would expect prices to increase in America. It takes a long time for supply chains to reroute, or for domestic suppliers to actually step in and maybe help reduce prices in the medium term. The immediate impact would be to see inflation pick up, and we have seen that upward revision to inflation expectations, as you said. A lot of the consumer surveys of inflation expectations are also picking up, and that's certainly something the Fed will be very mindful of. Even where policy is still highly uncertain, they will be looking at what consumers and other economic agents are expecting.
You mentioned the Fed there. Jerome Powell, of course, continues his semi-annual testimony to Congress later. He was very cautious yesterday to say it's too early to try and price in any of these tariffs. But do you think the Fed's now preparing to hold rates for longer than the market's expecting?
I think that's a reasonable expectation. The amount of uncertainty, and just given where inflation is in terms of the starting point, they can't afford to look through and purely just keep cutting interest rates in a vacuum. So I think they would be very mindful that inflation expectations have picked up, that there is actually a real chance of this feeding through. And also you have to bear in mind the economy is actually growing at a very solid pace. It's growing at above trend. So, it doesn't take much for inflation to actually start, getting those into the second round effects that central bankers typically really dislike.
Obviously, Hetal, none of these tariffs kick in immediately. For steel and aluminium, it's March the 12th. Do you think the market should expect a negotiation?
Given what we've seen so far, maybe that's a reasonable expectation. There just seems to be a huge amount of uncertainty. We started the year after the inauguration, it actually felt as if tariffs in general weren't top of the agenda. And then they kind of really came back on very quickly with the closest trading partners that the US has, Canada and Mexico. And so policy is so unpredictable. And this is why indicators of trade policy uncertainty are also so high. Until Trump took office back in 2016, so long-term index had never crossed over 100, and now we're looking at north of 300. So you can see that it's really embedded, this uncertainty, and it therefore makes it very difficult to predict.
That was Hetal Mehta of St James's Place, and you can watch more videos on Reuters.com.